About 6 years ago, I came to the realization that I literally wasn't in America anymore. I'd been in Israel for about 3 years. You'd think I'd have figured it out by then. But I wasn't cognizant of the Anglo bubble that I had lived in until I got into a conversation about gender and identity. As you can see, I'm wearing a mipachat, which is the traditional scarf for married women. I don't wear it because I like wearing it. I don't wear it to make a statement. I wear it because the practice has taken root in traditional Jewish sources. And as far as I can tell, I haven't yet found a reliable, empirical, authoritative source which would exempt me from this obligation. So I wear it, and in short, I wear it because it's the intellectually honest thing to do. Now, I'd been wearing a mipachat for about a year when things really started to come to a head, so to speak. My first year of head covering left me with a bit of a dilemma. I had on my desk 3 empty bottles of aspirin and a problem. And that's that I kept getting headaches, not to mention I couldn't stand how I looked. But that was another issue. And as I sat with my classmates at Hebrew University, outside of one of our English department courses, where we just discussed a lot about women's studies and about these types of issues with image, the conversation then suddenly shifted to how much my head hurt and how I couldn't reconcile what I was wearing and how I felt with the values that I was choosing to keep in wearing it. "You really shouldn't be wearing one of those anyway," one of my friends said to me. And all of my classmates agreed with her. Why? Because I was too liberal and intelligent to be wearing something that showcased women's oppression, at least in their opinion. But I left so frustrated, even if we never came to a conclusion. They couldn't cross this delta of cultural differences in front of us to understand that hair is just hair, and all we wanted was the same thing, and that's to be judged based on our merits and not on our looks. Now, the judgments that people have made occasionally because of the scarf on my head have had practical ramifications. I've been turned down before from job interviews because people have assumed that I'd be too family-focused to be able to rise to the occasion. And it's a distinction that I felt even more acutely when I moved across the Green Line to Ariel and began applying to my first jobs as a fledgling journalist. Once as a student, I was told to my face in Jerusalem by a restaurant owner that I wouldn't be able to man the teller because I would just have babies and then disappear. And later, as a graduate, it was once subtly indicated to me in the course of an interview that I wouldn't fit that publication's vision simply because of what I wore in my head and the facts on my resume. But they never even took the time to get to know me. Now, I will say a lot has changed since I entered the workforce. It's been a few years now, and I've encountered fewer and fewer of these phenomena, both personally and from stories I hear from my friends. It does seem that Israeli society is moving forward. But what struck me in preparing for these women's events for Talk 17 is how much I found I wasn't alone. I was surprised to find more than one person tell me that they had faced expectations of this type, and that society often does not expect women, especially not religious women, to become full-fledged professionals. What's odd is that, honestly, Israelis are by no means stuck in the past. Social benefits in Israel are far better than what's in the US today, and far more progressive. And yet, especially when it comes to religious women, for whatever reason, we're only expected to be able to survive so long before we get knocked back, barefoot and pregnant, into our kitchens, never to emerge. What really disturbs me is not even that. What shocked me was how when I approached different people about coming to our women's speakers and seeing this event today, I faced so much resistance, both from Jews and from Arabs and from traditional and secular Israelis, saying that I invited them on stage. Why would I want to go see them? All I can respond is this. What's kept me going throughout my career? I had not one, but 2 buzzcut sporting, social justice warrior, feminist professors of mine who gave me so much encouragement and encouraged me to keep the values that I keep and still keep going as a professional person. And I've worn their encouragement as a talisman, which has kept me going throughout my career, even though I am sure that they wouldn't have supported the idea of settlements. I've learned a lot about feminism over the years, kind of by osmosis. I think if you study English, it's inevitably part of your background. But I think it's debatable whether or not feminism today, depending on where you are, is really the same as what the feminist movement had originally envisioned. But what has struck me in everything that I've learned so far in my personal experiences are both how much things have changed historically and how much things haven't. Research and statistics can tell you a lot more about women's rights in the workforce today versus even 40 years ago. But on an anecdotal level, I will say this. My grandmother, bless her heart, in the 1960s, made this very difficult and very progressive decision for her time to not compromise on motherhood or her career. She stayed at home and taught Hebrew classes from her home with her 2 younger daughters, just to make sure that she can have both. And at the time, she was the only person that she knew who would make such a decision. I think it's a lot to think about when you realize that today, such a woman might be seen as not leaning in enough in the workforce. I don't know. But what really hasn't changed, in my opinion, is the attitude of the women's rights movement. And this is the problem. I quote here Mary Ann Weathers, a feminist who at the height of second-wave feminism in 1960s noted, against the backdrop of the civil rights movement, that the feminist movement in the US hadn't done enough for women of color and women from disadvantaged backgrounds. She said this: "All women suffer oppression, even white women, particularly poor white women, and especially Indian, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Oriental, and Black American women, whose oppression is trebled by any of the above mentioned. But we do have females' oppression in common. This means that we can begin to talk to other women with this common factor and start building links with them, and thereby build and transform the revolutionary force that we are now beginning to amass." Now, I don't live in America anymore. I don't feel qualified to comment on whether feminists today have addressed this and whether they've transcended their boundaries to be able to get this common goal achieved. But from my experience in Israel, we suffer from a different type of discrimination, and that's a location-based discrimination that affects both men and women, but hurts women the most. Technically speaking, both men and women living in Judea and Samaria don't have Israeli labor law applied to them, despite numerous attempts under the last 2 Knesset governments for Israeli law to be applied equally, no matter where you live. This means that practically, I could be fired during maternity leave, I could be made to work overtime hours, I could be skipped out on my salary, all because of where I live. In short, I'm powerless to assert my basic rights because according to Israeli law, those rights remain unenforceable based on the legal ambiguity of the place I choose to make my home. Now, what's the problem with this, and why does it apply specifically to women? Obviously, this affects men as well, and men have much to worry about in terms of making sure that their rights are upheld. No one's denying that. But naturally, especially as a young mother, I will say, there are situations that come up that are protected by Israeli law. So for example, I am supposed to get, at various points, a parenting hour where I can be able to nurse my child and have a little bit more time for myself. Or I cannot get fired, let's say, 60 days after maternity leave. My rights are now not protected, and the problem is that they are often not protected because of the oversight of the women's rights movement in Israel. Very often, it's the same groups that push forth women's rights that are also aligned with the traditional left, which means that they are against rights for so-called settlers, or people who live in Judea and Samaria, just because they live in Judea and Samaria. In effect, what they are doing, however, in pushing forward women's rights and excluding their brethren, is putting collective punishment on hundreds of thousands of Israeli women who are contributing equally to Israeli society, just because those women don't choose and often cannot afford to live in the urban population centers that are very expensive and very crowded and very traditionally the home of the Israeli left. So ultimately, I agree with Mary Ann Weathers. I think she was prescient in a way that she didn't even realize. And while the glass ceiling is a lot thinner than it was in the 1960s, and it could be debatable whether it's here at all, what we really need to do is to break down the glass houses that we've built between ourselves. Thank you.